Okay, so we're talking about today sectionalism and the Missouri Compromise. Okay, so obviously within sectionalism is that word section, where we're talking about the different, what start to be the different divisions in the United States regionally and geographically. And then we're going to look at how Missouri became a state and what the big conflict is during that time over Missouri joining the Union. Because Missouri threw off the balance. And so it was a big deal. And we'll see how that played into what the compromise was that they were able to come up with, that I don't know if it avoided civil war fully for the time, but there was a major crisis within the country over this issue of Missouri joining the Union. Okay, so if we look at this is kind of a general way to think about it, but if you look at the United States during that time, what starts to be the obvious divisions is you have the North, the South, and the West, and eventually there's going to be a civil war between the North, which will include the government of the United States, and the South, because the southern states will exit, several of them will exit the United States, and then there will be an event that triggers the other states to exit as well. And then there are some states here on the border that don't exit. And so they exit over the issue of slavery. But why slavery? Right? Why did they exit because of slavery? Because there were different things happening in the country during that time. The Constitution said that slaves had to be returned. The Congress was affirming that in many ways. The Lincoln said that when he became president, he didn't want to end slavery. He wanted to contain it where it existed. There was an amendment that was being written later on that would have basically said that the U.S. government could not interfere with slavery. And so later on, there will be a famous Supreme Court case, which called the Dred Scott decision, which said that a slave who was in a free state when his slaveholder died had to be returned. So basically, if you were a slave in one state, you could also be a slave where slavery was illegal. Anyway, all of these things, now there's these issues between the states, and the southern states are going to exit, and their leadership is going to take their states out of the United States later on during the Civil War. Now, this hasn't happened yet, but it's going to be over the issue of slavery. But why did they split over the issue of slavery? The North wasn't necessarily interested in fighting a war to free slaves, but they were interested in fighting a war that required exiting states to remain part of the United States. And why it came down to slavery is because in the United States, slavery became the focal point of which section of the Union was going to become dominant. Okay, so there are slave states and free states. Now, originally, when the American states fought in the Revolutionary War and became independent from Britain, most, if not all of them, were slave states. They had slavery. Now, a lot of states started to get rid of slavery and different things were going on. And so slavery started to become more focused regionally in the South rather than the North. But what you start to see is a competition for power between these two sections of the Union, and also kind of with the West as well later on, is you start to see slave states concentrated down here in the South, and there were different interests with these states. And you start to see free states concentrated in the North and different interests in the North, generally. And what they were attempting to do was they were attempting to control the US federal government, the government in Washington, D.C., because if you could control the government of the United States, you could have your way against the other side of the country, or if the other side of the country got control of Washington, D.C., and the US federal government, they could have control over your side of the country. So, really, this slavery represented not just the moral, ethical issue of slavery, but the issue of it represented geographical competition for power in the US government. Which side was going to be able to control the US government, and thereby controlling the US government, control the rest of the country? And so, in this process of competition for control through trying to control the national government, things are moving toward an inevitable civil war. That, yes, the focal point will be on slavery, but because slavery represents the issue of this geographical power competition between the states. So here's the map of the United States at that time. Okay, so the United States is not all of this continent that we think of today. Okay, the United States at this time is over here. Okay, so you can see this color, the states. Now, Missouri is trying to join the Union. Florida's not a state yet. Arkansas is not a state yet. Texas, this Missouri territory here. Okay, now Missouri wants to join the Union. It has slaves, and so therefore it wants to join the Union as a slave state. And so when it has attempts to join, there becomes this issue. Because in 1818 into 1819, the Union, which is the United States, had a balance of slave states and free states. Each side had a balance of 11. There were 11 free states in the North and 11 slave states in the South. Okay? Now, we may think, okay, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is, according to the US Constitution, you have the Congress, the legislative branch that writes laws. Okay? And you have this Congress has two chambers. One is the House of Representatives. Now, the House of Representatives, how many people are in it? Well, that was originally depending on how many people were in each state. And the more people that were in each state, the more people were in the House of Representatives. So like today, in America today, California has a lot of people, so they have 53 representatives in the House. Montana doesn't have that many people, so they have one representative in the House of Representatives. Now, so that means bigger states have more of a say or more numbers in the House of Representatives, bigger states by population. However, the other side of Congress is kind of what the issue is here, and that is called the Senate. Now, the other side of Congress, the Senate, has 2 senators per each state. Every state, no matter how big the state is or how many people are in it, they all get 2 senators, and only 2. So Today, Texas gets 2 senators, California gets 2 senators, Hawaii gets 2 senators, Wisconsin gets 2 senators, Florida gets 2 senators, Little Rhode Island gets 2 senators. Everybody gets 2 senators. Every single state of the 50 states that exist in America today get 2 senators. So that's why we have 100. Okay. Now, back then, the North had 11 states and the South had 11 states, or there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, which meant that the balance of senators from slave states and free states was equal. There were 22 senators from each side of the country. But the country's starting to divide and the interests are starting to divide based on North and South. So there are 11 Northern senators and 11 Southern senators. I'm sorry, there were 22 Northern senators and 22 Southern senators. If another state adds to the Union and comes in as a slave state or a free state, what's the problem? Well, depending on whether it comes in as a slave state or a free state, is it changes the balance in the Senate and therefore potentially makes that side of the country more powerful in the Senate. Okay, now there's obviously the other side of the Congress. There's the president as well. But now the balance of power would be different in the Senate. Okay, so this is why slavery becomes the focal point issue for other reasons as well, but because it represents a balance of power issue. So now Missouri became part of this conflict because it wanted to enter the Union as a slave state because it had slaves. It's considered kind of a southern state. Now, each state has 2 senators. So if Missouri is admitted, now the balance of power is tipped in favor of the slave states. But if it comes in as a free state, it's tipped in the power of the free states. So you have this issue between both sides of the Union where other states have been allowed to join without all this problem. But now Missouri comes in, and Missouri represents an issue over the competition for power in the Union. Now, this was a crisis, and I use that word sparingly, but this was a true crisis during this time, that it was seen that this might split the United States. And Thomas Jefferson, who was still alive during the time, though he would die only a few years later and not live to see what else would happen and see the Civil War, Thomas Jefferson believed that this issue would lead to the end of the Union, meaning it would be the end of the United States. And he was kind of right, because the Civil War that would later happen would so change the United States that it really wasn't the same as what was founded and what was created in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, or what was the plan when the Constitution came about in 1789 when it was accepted by the states. So the United States is going to be fundamentally changed by this issue. And Jefferson recognizes this with what he calls the Missouri question. Okay, so he said the Missouri question, this momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as the knell of the Union. So he said this issue, he talked about it being a fire bell. Imagine a fire alarm going off in the middle of the night. In towns during Jefferson's time, when there was a fire, there was this bell that would ring to let people know that there was a fire and that they had to respond to it. And so you can imagine being woken out of sleep by a bell because there's a fire, there's a crisis. But he said it awakened and filled me with terror. But he said, no, it's not the bell. It scared me like a fire bell. But he goes, no, I think that the bell ringing, metaphorically, is actually a funeral bell. I think it's a bell that would ring when someone has died. And who has died, according to Jefferson? He says the United States. That it's just a matter of time, because now the United States is headed in a path toward its own destruction. So he says, I considered it once a knell. A knell is the sound a bell makes. Considered it once as the knell of the Union. So Thomas Jefferson thought, this is the beginning of the end of the United States. And while the United States would live on and would continue in name after the Civil War, it is true that there is a fundamental change that took place during this era, and especially after the Civil War. Now, what did they come up with? Well, this guy, Henry Clay, helped work a compromise that dealt with the problem for a time, but would come up again later. Okay, so number one, Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. So they do compromise on that. Say, okay, so it will come in as a slave state, but they will add another free state called Maine. Okay, so Maine has not existed yet until this point. Maine was part of Massachusetts. So what they did was they figured, okay, there's enough people up here to justify having another state. So we will create the state of Maine out of the state of Massachusetts. Okay? But now they have this issue of where will slave states be geographically and where will free states be geographically? So what they came up with was they drew a line, an imaginary line across the country to say that slave states could exist below the line. New slave states could exist below the line. There were some slave states that existed above the line. But slave states could not, new slave states could not come into the Union above the line after this point in history. Okay, so they did avoid civil war for the time. Slavery would later be at the heart of the Civil War because of the desire for power in government in the North and South. So this competition for power between the two sections of the Union. Now here's what the line looks like, and it's called the 3630 line because this is where it was drawn as far as longitude and latitude. Okay, so they drew the line. Now there are still slave states above the line: Missouri, Kentucky, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and so on. There are still slave states above the line, but they said from here on out, any new states that get added to the Union, any new slave states have to be below the line. Any new free states have to be above the line. Now, why did the South and the slave states accept this deal? Because as we can see, there's a lot more land up here, and the line kind of, it doesn't exactly cut the country in half. It's a little bit low. You know, if it was like perfectly in half, it'd be a little bit higher. Well, the Southern bloc thought during this time, well, we're going to get a few more slave states and probably tip the balance in the Senate anyway, because Florida is going to come into the Union, and that will be a slave state. Arkansas is going to come into the Union, and that will be a slave state. And they also thought, well, the United States has expanded already. You know, it's had the Louisiana Purchase in the past and all this stuff. At some point, maybe Texas will come in, which it would, and it would come in as a slave state. And there's all this land down here in Mexico that might eventually become part of the United States. So they were partially right, partially wrong. They also thought that not a lot of this would be good for land and people, you know, living there and all that type of stuff. So they basically said, okay, well, yeah, you can have your free states up there. We'll take, you know, the land that we've got down here. Now, a question later that will arise is as the United States expands, there will be the Mexican-American War, that all of this will basically become part of the United States, which we'll talk about in a later time, how that happens. But does the line end here, or does the line extend all the way across? So later generations, a few decades later, will have to deal with this problem of interpretation of, does the line cut the country in half? Because none of this is owned by the United States at this time. So it really wouldn't make sense that this line goes all the way around the world. But on the other hand, does it really just stop right here? And so, and if it goes across, it cuts California right in half. And California in 1850 will try to join join the Union as a free state, but that will cause a bunch of issues as well in another compromise called the Compromise of 1850. And so the problems will persist. They didn't solve the problem. Instead, they just pushed the problems until later.